vote for this spending bill today. Wednesday morning, we knew that the 72-hour rule would be violated. We didn't have text yet, 48 hours out. And it was clear, though, that a majority of Republicans were willing to vote for the bill today, irrespective of what was in it, not knowing what the spending levels were, not knowing exactly how much it was increasing spending over the Pelosi-Schumer levels that are still in place today from the omnibus that was passed in December of 22. Not knowing the exact spending levels, not knowing how harmful the policies might be beyond the ones that the American people are already suffering under that are still in place from that omnibus. And they didn't need, I think one member said he'd vote for it if it was 72 minutes instead of 72 hours. You know, we don't need 72 hours to vote against a bad bill, but you would think if you're planning to vote for it, you might want to actually know what policies you will own by the virtue of your yes vote on that bill. Is there anything that some Republicans won't do to keep this government open? Why are we in a rush to keep this government open that is so harming the American people by the very policies which they are suffering under? But the bill, hey, one positive, I guess, it'll have thousands of earmarks for billions of dollars, earmarks which are used to buy or reward bad votes for bad votes for bad bills, like the bill that will pass today, it does seem. This bill, again, maintains the Pelosi-Schumer policies and spending levels. Actually, it increases the spending levels by about $60 billion that were in place from the omnibus that we all voted against a year and a half ago. But it has some new things that we want to point out here. It's got $1 billion for the climate focus of the military. How absurd is that? Think about what we might be able to do with $1 billion for our military Department of Defense to actually focus on lethality, force readiness, effectiveness, so that we might win a conflict that we hope not to have. But instead, the Biden administration is getting another $1 billion for the climate focus of the military, getting $200 million for a new headquarters for this FBI. Why would any Republican vote to give $200 million to this FBI for a new headquarters? It continues to fund the WHO, the tool of communist China that was used to deceive us during the COVID virus situation, and that the WHO that President Trump wisely defunded, that Joe Biden put back in place funding for as soon as he got into office, the WHO that Biden wants to surrender our sovereignty to 60-some days from now, so that in a so-called crisis deemed by the WHO, we would be forced to comply with what the WHO said in whatever they deem to be a health crisis or a climate crisis or a poverty crisis, or so-called gun violence crisis. So we're going to continue to fund the WHO. It's got $32 million for the UN Population Fund, but I misspeak, the UN Abortion Fund, and $3 billion more for the Department of Homeland Insecurity. This DHS under Mayorkas and Biden that continues to perpetrate this invasion on the American people. We have entered a new era when it comes to the border invasion, a new era yesterday. Many of you, I hope, saw the video that we saw, where at first we thought, is this a third world country? Is this a banana republic? When we saw the alien mob rush, the bum rush of border officials to force their way into this country. How have we got to that point today where we are allowing illegal aliens to bum rush border officials and force their way into the country? And yet the Biden administration's response, is it to ramp up efforts to repel the invasion? No. Their intention is to prevent Texas from securing their border. They will go to unlimited lengths to prevent Texas from securing their border and keeping their citizens safe. But they don't seem to care about the aliens forcing their way, literally forcing their way into our country, overcoming border personnel. Either we show the willingness to respond and repel and deter this kind of activity, or we can just go ahead and fund it. And the bill that's being voted on today will be Republicans joining with Democrats to fund this DHS. Instead, we must say enough, not on our watch. And we need 146 Republicans today, 146, 2/3, to vote against this bill today. 1/3 can go ahead and vote for it. But if just 2/3 would join us and vote against this bill, it will not pass on the floor under suspension. So I'm privileged to be here with my colleagues to speak against this bill, to speak against funding this government and these policies, and to speak against funding this border invasion, which reached a new low yesterday. And with that, I yield to Chairman Scott Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my colleagues, and I thank all of you. It's March, right? March Madness. Now, while some people in Washington, D.C. are misspelling their favorite team on their bracket. The rest of the country is watching their country in March and the madness burn down in Washington, D.C., and at their southern border. As a person who was honored to wear the uniform for decades, I watched those service members, uniformed service members at the border. What were they supposed to do? Right? They're put there, somebody put them there to stop the invasion. Well, how are they going to stop it? What are their rules of engagement? And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, the people that ran over them, that ran right over them, ran to Border Patrol to come into this country. Border Patrol taking orders from Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas. That's the March Madness that's happening at our country. And what is the left, the Democrats, what are they going to run on when they pass this bill? 22,000 border agents, 41,500 detention beds. 22,000 border agents, not on the border, not standing on the border with uniformed service members because they're back processing people illegally into the country. That's what they're doing. The beds will go unslept in. We're going to have more of them. These people aren't going to the beds. These people are coming to your community to sleep in a bed in your community, in our communities. And this bill today funds all of that, continues to fund all of that. Every single Republican should vote no, and should be ashamed of ever voting yes. This is our opportunity. This is the time. Remember, this was supposed to be done last September. We're now in the middle of March of the next year. This is their opportunity to say what happened on the border yesterday that all of America is now looking at as they wake up this morning. This is going to stop, and it's going to stop with us. And if they don't vote no on this bill, what they're saying to their constituents, their bosses who sent them to Washington, D.C., Democrat or Republican, what you saw at the border, that's fine with me. That's good. Let's get more of that. I urge all of our colleagues, not just the brave ones that are standing here today in front of you, but every single member of the House, Republican and Democrat, reject this bill. I yield. Mr. Burleson.
Thank you, Chairman Good. Thank you, Chairman Perry. You know, when I came up here, I thought we had the majority, but it appears that we don't have a majority of fiscally responsible individuals. We're here because just 30 hours ago, the Uniparty put forward a 1,000-page bill that no one can tell me that they've read before they're going to vote yes on it, to spend $1.2 trillion, and we're expected to vote on it in just a couple hours. It's not acceptable. When I first came to Congress, I was warned that this is how this town operates. But I had a glimmer of hope that we had the majority, that we had enough people that were fiscally sane, and that this time it would be different. Unfortunately, it's not different. So here we go again. For the last 3 years, we've been complaining about all of these things. Republicans who campaigned complained about the border issue. And yet, the actions today refuse to do anything about it, to actually do anything about it. You see, we'll pass bills, that ultimately mean nothing because we know that they're not fully going to pass. They're not going to make their way through the Senate, whether it's H.R. 2, impeaching Mayorkas, the new Lake and Riley resolution. All of these things ultimately are not going to change anything. And yet today, we're going to use our majority, quote unquote majority, to enact no changes whatsoever. We're going to fund it all. The bottom line is that this is a complete and utter surrender. And I'm going to be not only a no, a hell no on this bill. It completely ignores the fact that we are at a place that we've never been in the history of the United States. At $34 trillion in debt, we're at a greater debt to GDP than we were during World War II. And we didn't just finish a war, folks. We're approaching potential World War III across the globe. How is the United States fiscally going to be able to sustain any kind of major conflict when we're not willing to make the cuts that are necessary? So I'm glad to stand with my colleagues here today who are the fiscally responsible parts of the House of Representatives. And I will yield the next part of my time to my good friend from Texas, Chip Roy.
Well, Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank my colleagues. I am so proud to stand here alongside these great friends, these great patriots who are willing to stand in the breach for the American people while, unfortunately, we see the uniparty, to use some phrasing that some of my colleagues have used, in action. People ask, I could go down all the laundry list of problems. Chairman Good did a great job outlining it, so did Chairman Perry. I'm sure everybody here, we can come up, we can go down the list of earmarks, we can go down the list of egregious funding in this bill. I did on the House floor last night. But the only thing that really matters here right now are the hardworking American people out there who are left holding the bag. When the people that they send to Washington campaign on doing one thing and then come here and do the exact opposite. And I've been watching social media today because I called out some Republicans on the House floor last night, and I called out some of the so-called conservative groups out there last night on the House floor who are MIA in this fight because they like to have access to political power. The time for all of that is over. The time for continuing the same games in this town is over. There's no more time left. I was meeting with an automobile manufacturer this morning, talking about the extent to which the rule that was finalized on Wednesday, the tailpipe rule, will force them to go to basically 2/3 EV manufacturing by 2032, which means they've got to start building out their supply chain right now. That will fundamentally alter and destroy the livelihoods of millions of Americans, driving up the cost of their vehicles, driving up the cost of goods, while you've got EVs piling up on lots as we speak. I could sit here and give an entire speech on that issue alone. Yet what are my Republican colleagues going to do today? Fund it. You all know what's going on the border. My friend Chairman Perry talked about the 100 that bum rushed the National Guard in El Paso. That's making all the headlines in the last 24 hours, but it's relentless every single day. Republicans pass a bill and name it after Laken Riley and pat themselves on the back and say, look what we did. We sent a bill and we sent it right over to the Senate for it to die so I can go campaign all year on the border. So I can use that beautiful little girl as a campaign prop. Enough. Those same people that fund it today, they own it. Anybody who votes for this bill today owns every stinking bit of it. They own the destruction of the American economy with all these regulations killing families. They own the wide open borders causing death and destruction. They own the fentanyl pouring into communities. If you fund it, you own it. And unfortunately, too many Republicans come to this town and they use what's called the swamp glossary. Go look out there on Twitter. Good friend of mine puts a bunch of stuff out there that outlines a lot of the swamp glossary. You guys hear it every single day. Frankly, our Republican leadership are basically walking swamp glossary. There's always an excuse for what we can't do. Always a reason. The majority's too thin. Oh, I'd be there with you if I could wave my magic wand. We've got elections this year. I asked one of them on the floor yesterday, I said, well, what happens if we run the trifecta, we win the White House, we get the House back, we get the Senate. What are you going to do next January? What are you going to do? And I told them what they're going to do. They're going to say, we don't have 60 votes in the Senate. Yes, that's right. And you know what that individual said? Well, yeah, we're going to have a conversation about that. There is always an excuse for Republicans to fail. We're here to say that we're going to succeed for the American people. I'm here and I'm happy. This is as happy as I can possibly be because these people came here to go fight for the hardworking American getting screwed by the swamp and by corporate cronyism, making health care unaffordable, making their streets unsafe, making it impossible to go buy a car affordably. And they're tired of it. And they want their country back. And the excuses coming out of Republicans are not getting the job done. So today, I want to be very clear. Any Republican who votes for this bill, they own it, and they are the ones risking the election. It's the people that are going around saying, but oh, we'll cost the election. Oh, but what happens if we have a shutdown? They're the ones running in fear rather than leading. They're the same ones who will go stand up in Normandy on June 6th, praising those men who walked into a wall of bullets and looked at a cliff and scaled it to save our country and to save the world from fascism, praising their courage while curling up in the corner, afraid to stand up for the American people who are suffering today. Enough. I'm proud to stand with these great patriots saying no to this bill and yes to the American people. No to the continuation of the uniparty that is coalescing against the American people, and rather, we're going to stand up and fight for them. I'm not afraid of a shutdown. That's swamp excuse. I'm for standing up for funding a government doing its core constitutional duty, and that's what we're here to do. And I'm proud to do it. And with that, I'll pass over to my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Chip. You know, I woke up this morning to a text from an elderly lady in South Carolina. She had watched the bum rush, and she said, when is Congress going to do anything to stop the invasion at the border? And she ended her text with, the deaths that will occur are going to be on the hands of Congress for not doing something about it. Folks, how long are we going to, as Chip said, and Bob and others, fund a government that's working against us? How long are we going to put up with thousands of our young people dying from fentanyl due to the invasion from China? How long are we going to put up with this insane spending? Biden says pay your fair share. Let me ask you the question. You want $500 million to go to Jordan to put up a wall? Do you want $125 million to help Egyptians attend college in Egypt? Is your fair share to go an 8% pay raise for a guy that we just impeached, Mayorkas, who is implementing all this? Do we want $286 million going to Title X funding, and as Bob said, to fund the abortion industry? Folks, enough is enough. And I'm proud to stand with these true patriots who are willing to take whatever comes. The bum rush, for each one of you in the media, it's coming to your city, to your county, to your state in a different form, but it could be that exact form. Now, what's the solution? You know, I've heard enough of, we're going to lose the majority. We got the majority now. We act on the majority now, however the number. But now is our time to highlight anybody that signs this insanity. As Chip says, they own it. They own it with all this insane spending, which we get 24 hours to review, 1,000 pages. Would you buy a car with 1,000 pages that you don't review? Would you buy a toaster? Would you buy anything? No. Now, what's the solution? Here's what I'm calling on Speaker Johnson to do. And only he can do it. After we leave today, the mace has to be in place. It's a 184-year-old tradition to have the mace when the House is in session. Take the mace down, cut the lights off, and say, we will not come back until you stop the invasion at the border. H.R. 2 or any other logistical message that they have that will shut it down, not just paper. Shut it down. Take the mace down and not come back. If the Senate wants to sit on it, sit on it. You're the one owning this. And as Chip said, it's going to always be an excuse. You know, we don't have the Senate votes. We don't have this or we don't have that. No, it's our time. This is our time to do something good for the American people. The government cannot continue to run ramshot over the taxpayers. And anybody that signs this, anybody that agrees to this, as we have said, they're going to own it and they're going to agree into all this spending of money that we do not have. I call on my good friend Warren Davidson.
Good job, bro. All right, Warren.
Thank you all. Thanks for covering this, and it's a sad day for our country. We're here really to solve problems and serve people, and we're here talking about something that, you know, anyone can find an excuse. Leaders find a way, and I'm sad because we have not yet found a way to have a smaller government. We've not yet found a way to restore a government small enough to fit in our Constitution. We could afford a government that size. We can't afford this kind of government. This government isn't even doing its most basic responsibility, which is to secure and defend this country. We literally have an invasion at our border. We have a leadership structure in the executive branch that is undermining the entire concept of citizenship. and we are not servicing the citizens of this country. They're back home being buried by debt, buried by crime, buried by this invasion at the southern border, literally buried by fentanyl, all kinds of other drugs, suicide at record high levels, buried by endless wars, failing schools, corruptions. It's a fatal overdose of government. And we have people that are trusted to stop that, voting for this nonsense. They've wasted all year not solving these problems. They've wasted all year finding a way to preserve the status quo, and not even that, making it worse. We're adding $1 trillion worth of debt every 100 days, and this bill accelerates the path to the crash site. Eventually, we'll arrive at it, and with the benefit of hindsight, a lot of these same people will stand around the smoldering crash site of our economy and our country, of our sovereign currency, the world's reserve currency, and they'll claim the problem was we didn't have enough government. We got to have a smaller government. We told the people we were going to have a smaller government, and we told the people we were going to secure the border. Today is a total failure. It's a sad day. I'd yield to my colleague, Eli Crane.
Joe Warren.
I'll be brief. I'm definitely not as eloquent as many of my colleagues up here. First, I want to speak to the politicians up here that are going to vote for this. Like many of my colleagues have said, you own it. All the garbage, all the funding for borders overseas, but you won't lift a finger to stop the invasion at our southern border. Here's the deal, guys. The American people, though they may be busy running their businesses, raising their families, they are busy, but they're not dumb. And they are gracious. They don't expect us to win every fight. They know that we're outnumbered up here. But here's the deal. They do expect us to fight. And that is something that this party has refused to do time and time again. And it's one of the most frustrating things to be a part of. We know what the Democrats are going to do. They're going to destroy the country. They're driving us off the cliff at 95 miles per hour. Well, guess what? Our solution, the Republican Party, we're going to dial that down to 90 miles per hour, but we're still driving this thing off the cliff. We're backing it down a couple degrees, and it's pathetic. All right? Pick a principled fight. I don't know, maybe like the border invasion. I hear leadership say it's the hill we're going to die on. Really? Do you even know what that means? That means you got to take a hill and be willing to die on it. I don't see it. And until I see it, I'm not going to be like a lot of politicians up here and be a cheerleader for it. Because it's garbage and it's destroying this country. It's destroying the future for my kids and your kids. Now I want to speak really quickly to the American people. I know you're busy. I know it's hard out there. I know you're being killed by inflation. I know many of you have lost your kids to fentanyl. If you want to help us, start paying attention. And please quit sending politicians up here who come to your town, who come to your Lincoln Reagan Day dinner talking about fiscal responsibility, border security, and then they vote on this crap repeatedly. You can help us. Quit sending them up here, because in case you guys haven't noticed, we are radically outnumbered. It's always the same names. It's always the same names of people trying to stop it. And it's always the same names, unfortunately, who talk a good game in the media and back at home in their districts. And then they come up here and they vote for this crap, hoping that you don't pay attention. You can help us. Clearly, I'm a hell no on this bill. Thank you. Let's see. Mr. Ogles, you're next.
Thanks, Eli. Good job.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you to my colleagues. At roughly 2:30 in the morning, 1,000 pages were dropped, over $1 trillion in spending, and we're expected to vote on it without reading it, It was Nancy Pelosi who said you have to pass it to know what's in it. Yet this was Republicans pulling that crap. Now, some will say that the Republicans are in the majority in the House, but it's clear that the Democrats own the Speaker's gavel. Because this bill, it's not a Republican piece of legislation. It's keeping the border open. It's funding transgender kits and proms in the Northeast. It allows for gain of function research in China. Think about that for a minute. We're finally coming out of COVID. Our economy is still trying to revive itself. Families are hurting, inflation is high, and there's an allowance in this bill for gain of function research in China. What the hell are we doing? This is not a conservative piece of legislation. It's not a Republican piece of legislation. And you know what? Leadership's panicked because last night they didn't have the votes. And I don't know what they're going to have to sell or what they're going to have to trade to get there, but if this passes, no, they sold you out. They sold us out. And I, for one, am pissed. This bill, if passes, will likely determine who controls the House of Representatives. And this bill will most certainly determine who the next speaker is. I yield to the gentleman, Mr. Klein.
Thank you. Thank you to the gentleman from Tennessee, and thank you, Chairman Good, for leading this. Well, we have officially have the swamp's recipe for the failing of the American people. A massive government funding bill, chock full of wasteful spending, harmful policies, and pork projects. Truly, and I mean truly, released in the middle of the night, as was mentioned, 2:30 in the morning, giving lawmakers a little more than 24 hours to read an over 1,000-page monstrosity, only to pass it under suspension of the rules, relying on more Democrat votes than Republican votes, in a House Republican majority. Just like the first package, the swamp's second half of the omnibus represents a total surrender by Republican leadership. You know, compromise is one thing, but capitulation and surrender is a whole different beast. One that routinely serves Washington instead of serving the American people. To my House and Senate Republican colleagues, it's time to put your money where your mouth is. Because you can't claim to be a pro-life champion and then fund abortion, abortion travel, and aborted fetal tissue research. You can't rail against President Biden's intentional illegal invasion and then fund the policies that are causing the chaos without assuming the same responsibility. Just like you can't flaunt your vote to impeach Secretary Mayorkas and then fully fund his salary and his destructive border policies. You can't defend Americans' Second Amendment liberties and then fund gun control by the CDC. You can't support science and protect young women and then fund transgender surgeries and fund educational institutions that allow biological males to compete in women's sports. And I don't call them men, I call them biological males. Real men protect women, and they don't use their superior strength to steal the honor, hard work, and achievements of women. So all you ladies out there, I want to hear you like Riley Gaines. Speak up. We're fighting for you. You can't advocate for election integrity and then fund illegal aliens voting in federal elections. You can't complain about the violation of Americans' First Amendment rights and then fund more disinformation governance boards and government by proxy censorship. You can't sound the alarm on our dire economic outlook and ballooning national debt and then rubber stamp spending higher than Nancy Pelosi's levels from fiscal year 23. And the list goes on and on. Republicans simply cannot righteously denounce Democrats' disastrous policies that are destroying our great country and then turn around and fund them. Yet many will do that very thing later this morning, and the American people will surely take note of those who do. After all, if you fund it, you own it. But it's not too late. We promised the American people that we would fix these problems, not fund these problems. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on the swamp's second half omnibus so we can deliver on that promise. Thank you now, and I'd like to yield to my good friend from Arizona, Chairman Andy Biggs.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and I thank Chairman Good and Chairman Perry and my colleagues behind me. You know, just yesterday, it's ironic. Senator Braun's resolution that the national debt is a security crisis and the security threat passed UC in the Senate. Of course it did. Ironic, isn't it? When I introduced that piece of legislation several years ago, there were $21 trillion in national debt. Speaker at the time wouldn't let that bill come to the floor. And now we're sitting at 34.5 trillion, rolling it up about $1 trillion every 120 days in national debt, new national debt. And the same yo-yos that just passed and acknowledged that a national debt's a security threat, they're going to take this package and they're going to pass it. That's what's going to happen unless sanity begins to rule. Now, if we take a look at the Budget Control and Impound Act, it requires 12 appropriation bills be passed in this body where the Constitution says we originate spending bills, and it gets to the Senate. We're supposed to get to the Senate by June 30th of every year. You know the last time that happened? Can you know, I had to give a prize. 1977. That's the last time that was done properly. And you know what? We were promised a little over a year ago when that speaker was brought in, he said, we're going to do those 12 spending bills, doggone it, for 2024. We're going to get them over to the Senate. That was one reason some of us acquiesced and said, well, okay, well, if we got a shot at it, we want to do it. We got one, and then he didn't transmit the bill. And now what we've got is we've got a speaker who says, we're going to have to, it's all we can do. This is all we can do. It's tough. We don't have enough. Well, what I say to the speaker, and I've told him to his face, and I say it again, is you know what? The American people, they're watching what we do. And they know something. If you surrender, you lose every time. But if you fight, you got a chance to win once in a while at least. I'm not saying we don't have a tough road because we've got, in name, we have a very slim majority. And in reality, maybe we don't even have a majority. But doggone it, fight. This is capitulation. This is surrender. Well, you know, the reality of it is, these guys behind me, and the lady behind me, they we're all together. Yeah, very good. I didn't forget you, Anna. We all know that this bill is chock full of crap, and you know it, and the American people know it. And you're going to see people who campaigned on the Republican Party platform of reduced spending, reduction of the national debt, responsible government, reduction of regulation, pro-life, whatever. That's the platform. But they're all going to go out there, and there's going to give enough votes for this to pass today. Maybe. Yeah, maybe. Unless rationality sets in. And if there's no rationality setting in, we're going to be adding to the national debt, and we're going to further the destruction of this country. And I'll just tell you this, the invasion you saw in Texas yesterday, that's an ongoing thing. Right. Don't tell me this is the hill you're going to die on, Mr. Speaker. Look at, this has been going on in Lukeville, where they're cutting the fence and people are flowing in every day. And that's in Arizona. That's in Arizona. This is an invasion. What you saw yesterday is just another example of the invasion. Doggone it, Mr. Speaker. Do the right thing. Pull this bill. Run legislation, which I've introduced, which would give you a partial shutdown, but stop funding the government that wants to emasculate the sovereignty and freedom of the American people. With that, I yield to Rosendale.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. And Chairman Good, thank you so much for organizing this press conference today. And I am really proud to be here with many of the same folks that you see standing on the floor or in this room and talking about what we need to do to rein in the size and scope of our federal government. I've got the unenviable position of being pretty much the last guy speaking, so all the points have been made. And what I would like to start off with is say, I concur. I concur with everything that has been said here. So what I'm going to go to is the process. The process is something that we fought extremely hard for January a year ago to restore regular order in the United States Congress, because everyone recognizes that this place is broke, that this system is broke. And the reason that it is broke is because process has been ignored. Process has been thrown out the window. And we have seen the consolidation of the power of the decisions that are being made here in this city placed into the hands of a very few. And that is not the way that it is supposed to work. That is why we fought to get 72 hours notice for any legislation. That is why we fought to make sure that we had single subject legislation instead of these monstrous bills that contain so many titles and subjects and issues that people don't have the ability to separate out and let each one be considered on its own merits. And that is why we fought to have an open rule system so that we could have discussion, debate, collaboration, and amendments, not only in committee, but on the House floor. And all of that has been thrown out the window. You've got the leadership and the White House making decisions about how the entire country is supposed to be run, which leaves 450 people outside of the discussion. And that's not what the American people asked for. That's not what the American people elected. And so what I say is, if you have a bad process, then you're going to end up with a bad product. And folks, what you see on display today is Exhibit A. That's what it is. It's a very bad product. And hopefully, enough Republicans will gather up the courage to say, enough is enough. We're not going to watch our country be destroyed any longer, whether it's from the mounting debt or the invasion that's taking place on our southern border, and we will not support this bad product. Now, I will guarantee somebody in this room, when we go to Q&A, is going to say, but members, isn't there something that you like? Isn't there something good in this piece of legislation? Why could you vote against the entire thing? The only good thing that I have discovered so far is that it only has $2 billion worth of earmarks instead of the $12 billion worth of earmarks that were sandwiched into the last minibus. That's the only redeeming feature that I have found in it. With that, I turn over to my good friend, Mr. Burchett.
Quote the immortal words of Forrest Gump, I want to thank Chairman Good for letting me crash his Black Panther party, because I'm the sole member up here who is not a member of the Freedom Caucus, but I stand with them today on this very important issue. When I first took office and this border issue was already an issue, I can remember we started talking then, and I said, you know, no border, no budget. That's how important it is. That's how important it is to the American people. We talk about having the majority and what that means. I don't care. If we lose our country, it's not worth it. It is absolutely not worth it. And I talk about my folks all the time, but I always think about the sacrifices they made. And I remember my daddy talking about an island that they hit, and he was really afraid. He had a bad feeling, but he knew he had to do the right thing, and he did the right thing. And he was victorious. And if we do not do the right thing in this occasion, we will lose our country. You are seeing the beginning of the end for the United States of America. And I stand with these wonderful men and women on this day, and I stand with pride, because they are doing, dadgummit, they're doing the right thing. And this is the right thing. We've got to make a stand. We've got to take our country back. Dadgummit, if you don't like the people in office, vote their asses out. I don't care if you play golf with them. I don't care if you go to church with them. Get them out of here. They are ruining your country. Don't let them come home and throw you the red meat and say, oh, I'm voting against this, I'm voting against that. That's a bunch of garbage. They are selling your country out for the uniparty, for these national chambers of commerce that wreck every dadgum thing. Look, they want somebody on your roof that doesn't speak the language, that is not from this country, that is not here legally. Because you know what happens when they fall off? They kick their ass out, they throw them to the curb, they're in the emergency room, you and I are paying for their health care, and they don't give a damn about them one bit. And that's what these national chambers of commerce, that's what the uniparty is. Write that in your dadgum newspapers. We've got to take our country back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, I'll have Chairman Perry and Chairman Biggs come join me up here to take some questions. You know, it's interesting, and to some of the points that were just made, these folks who will vote for this bill will go back and fundraise and talk the same language that we're talking today after they voted for this very bill. So we'll take a few questions. Yes, ma'am.
It's very clear that you all are very angry about this bill, but doesn't the buck stop with the House Speaker? It's in his hands to put this on the floor. Why not motion to vacate?
Well, the Speaker should today, in light of the heightened situation at the border illustrated by the bum rush yesterday, which, as Chairman Biggs said, is not unique. It was just caught on video on a larger scale. The Speaker ought to say, you know what? This terrible bill that gives Democrats everything they want, the reason why they'll vote for it 99%, you know, at a minimum, we're going to attach HR to it with performance mechanisms in place that's going to be required for them to get the money to fund this government, and stop, pause, slow down, attach border security to that bill before he passes it. That's what the Speaker ought to do. Frankly, can't defend the Speaker. It is the Speaker's decision to bring this to the floor for a vote. You guys ask us every day about the status of the Speaker, but I don't think anybody here talked cavalierly or flippantly about the Speaker a year ago. We focused on policy, we focused on actions, we focused on performance or lack thereof, and we're doing the same thing today. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two quick questions. One, what happens if Republicans don't get the majority on this vote today? How are you all thinking of, I don't know, retaliating might be too strong of a word, but retaliating itself?
We do have a Republican Party rule that requires legislation not to be brought to the floor for a vote that doesn't have a majority Republican support. And so I would hope the Speaker would adhere to that. And I would hope that that majority will be denied today. If that's denied today, he doesn't have a majority. If we could get, well, actually, we need 2/3 Republicans to vote against it, then it won't pass. And so our mission is to try to persuade our colleagues not to vote for it. Or if they do vote for it, to do as I think it was Mr. Rosendale who said, but to make it as uncomfortable and as painful as possible for them, to expose them to their constituents back home on who's working for them and who's working for the people here in Washington.
Elaborate on that point, because several of you mentioned that you're going to spend the rest of your majority highlighting how some of these members voted in support of this bill.
Well, unfortunately, we are left with that. And it's very interesting, by the way. Some of the members, they don't care how they vote. They just don't like us to tell people how they vote. And, you know, if you don't want people to know how you vote, you probably should vote differently.
Will you be campaigning?
Somebody else. Yes, sir.
Do you think there needs to be a purge in leadership, maybe not related to Speaker Johnson, but top down, the 2, 3, 4 positions?
This is not a personnel discussion for us today. We're talking about the bill and the policy today. So somebody else that has a question that's not about that.
I got an HR 2 one if you want. You know, McCarthy did have a CR back when that was being debated that would have had HR 2 attached to it. I believe there were some provisions taken out, but a lot of you voted against that. Would that have been an opportunity to negotiate some of the provisions in HR 2 into the government?
Well, I'll just say we're in a different situation today than we were. We had a stronger hand a year ago, and we should have played that hand. If we played that hand appropriately, we wouldn't be where we are here today. We wouldn't have a new speaker, quite frankly. We're not in the same situation. You know, I remind you, going into the last week of September, turns out the last week of the previous speaker's tenure as speaker, we had passed 1 out of 12 appropriations bills going into the last week of September. after it was promised that we'd bring all 12 to the floor. We passed 10 out of committee, 7 on the floor. Ultimately, I'm sorry, that's what we ultimately did, but we only had 1 out of 12 passed on the floor going into last week of September. If you guys are itching, jump in. Yes.
Mr. Good. 2 questions. First, are you guys planning any stall or delay tactics today to try to push back the vote and try to convince more of your colleagues?
Well, we wouldn't tell you.
Wait, can I ask one more? I have one more. Okay,
Michael
so-
has
so
one
I
more.
want- and you guys talk about how you want to focus on process and on policy, which you have, but we're at the end of the appropriations fight now, and you didn't get the process you wanted, and you didn't get the policy you wanted. So shouldn't there be consequences in leadership for you not getting that as we are now at the end of the appropriations process?
Well, I just say we have talked to leadership publicly and privately about the fact, what is the reason to have a different expectation as we approach fiscal year 25 funding deadline, which is September 30, 6 months from now? Think about it. That's 35 days before an election. One could imagine that Chuck Schumer in the Senate might just say, you know what, on our terms or nothing. And we might say, well, golly gee, we'd like to have things be different. Shucks. But we can't have a shutdown 35 days before the funding for the government expires, and 35 days before an election. And what would prevent us from allowing the Senate and the White House to dictate how we fund the government for another 12 months based on the past history that we've seen since we've had the majority over these last 14 months? Yes, sir.
Last question. Speaking of process, there's a lot of talk about appropriations bills, but never a budget resolution. Does the Freedom Caucus want the House to do that? Why have we skipped that?
Well, I'll remind you, one of the other promises made by the previous speaker, and I like putting that in front of his name, the previous speaker, was he promised to bring a balanced budget vote to the floor. Not to mention term limits, not to mention impeach Mayorkas, not to mention some other things, not to mention January 6 tapes being released. And again, he brought 1 out of 12 spending bills we passed before the final week of September. What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Where's the budget resolution?
Oh, yes. Our committee, the budget committee that some of us serve on, I know Mr. Norman serves on it with me and some of the others that are here, we have passed a balanced budget out of committee. We would like it brought to the floor to vote on. We would like to bring the RSC budget that many of us are part of, chaired by the budget task force chaired by Ben Klein, who's a member of the House Freedom Caucus. I served on that task force, which balances in 7 years. But I'll give you a comparison. Yesterday in our budget committee, we had Biden's budget director, which is a funny term for Biden, that he has a budget director, Shalonda Young. And now, mind you, she was coming to talk about Biden's proposed budget. That's why she was coming. So she had one job, come talk about that budget. And when I asked her how much the president's stated written budget that she was there to talk about, not a trick question, how much would it increase the debt by over the 10 years? She didn't know the answer to that question. She didn't know that it was $18 trillion to take it from 35, 34 to 52 in 10 years without supplemental emergency extra spending. That's what Biden was projecting to do. That's the Democrat Party. That's Biden. We're trying to bring the House Budget Committee 10-year budget, the RSC 7-year budget. Heck, we would go even further. We'd do it a lot quicker than that. Andy Biggs has a wonderful proposal to cut it much more quickly. We voted for hundreds of amendments to cut spending. And I think we got maybe 170 votes for most of those, by the way, hundreds of those, when we have 220 Republicans, or did at that time. So, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. They should use that.
Because then we put in the speakers.
They should use that.
Okay, cool.